Everyone knows the name Hirohito, but almost no one knows what actually happened to him after the war ended. For decades, the story got buried under headlines, political maneuvering, and Cold War calculations, hidden behind layers of diplomatic silence so thick that the full picture didn't emerge for generations. No real accountability, no public trial, just a decision made quietly in the halls of power that would shape Japan's future and America's reputation for the rest of the 20th century. What you're about to hear is the real story. The debates that raged behind closed doors. The men who wanted Hirohito hanged, and the men who protected him. The political calculation that may have been one of the most consequential choices any occupying power ever made. And the question that still doesn't have a clean answer. Was it the right call? If this kind of history is what you're here for, make sure you subscribe right now. This channel goes deep on the stories that textbooks summarize in a paragraph, but that deserve hours of unpacking. Hit the button. You won't regret it. Now, let's go back to August 1945, because to understand what happened to Hirohito after the surrender, you have to understand what the world thought of him in the moments before it. The Pacific War had been savage in a way that defied easy description. Not just in terms of casualties, though those were staggering, not just in terms of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in terms of what had been done across Asia and the Pacific in the name of the Japanese emperor over nearly 15 years. Manchuria, Nanking, the Philippines, Bataan, Singapore, Korea, China, the comfort women's system, the POW camps where Allied soldiers died of starvation, disease, and deliberate cruelty, Unit 731 and its biological experiments on human beings. All of it had been conducted under the banner of Imperial Japan. All of it had been framed as service to the divine emperor sitting in Tokyo. By the time Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the rage directed at Hirohito was enormous. Allied populations who had watched their sons, husbands, and brothers come home in coffins, or not come home at all, wanted someone to answer for it. They wanted a reckoning. They wanted accountability at the highest level. And in the minds of millions, the highest level was Hirohito himself. But here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the clean narrative of post-war justice starts to crack and splinter under the weight of what the Americans actually decided to do. Because the Americans had a problem, not a moral problem at first, though that would come later. They had a practical problem, and it was this. Japan had just surrendered, but Japan had not collapsed. It was still a functioning society, still a country with millions of people, a surviving government apparatus, and an imperial system that had been the center of Japanese life for centuries. The question wasn't just what to do with Hirohito the man. The question was what to do with Japan the nation, and whether those two things were even separable. General Douglas MacArthur understood this better than almost anyone. MacArthur, who had been appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, was now effectively the most powerful man in Japan. He controlled everything: the occupation, the military government, the reconstruction, the fate of war criminals, the future of the emperor. All of it flowed through MacArthur's office in the Daiichi Insurance Building in Tokyo. And MacArthur, whatever his considerable faults and his ego that could fill a room without him even being present, was a man who thought in strategic terms that went far beyond the immediate appetite for revenge. MacArthur's assessment of the Japan situation was blunt, and it was decisive. He believed that if Hirohito were tried as a war criminal, Japan would become ungovernable, that if the emperor were removed, humiliated, put in the dock alongside his generals and ministers, the Japanese population would not accept the legitimacy of the occupation. There would be resistance, possibly armed resistance, at minimum a psychological and social breakdown that would require hundreds of thousands of additional Allied troops to manage. He put it in stark numbers in a message to Washington. He estimated that trying or executing Hirohito could require an additional 1 million American troops to occupy and stabilize the country. Whether that number was accurate or political posturing by MacArthur, it had the desired effect on Washington. But MacArthur wasn't operating in a vacuum. The debate over what to do with Hirohito had actually begun before the war even ended. It had been simmering in diplomatic and military circles since at least 1943, when it became clear that the Allies were going to win, and the question of what post-war Japan would look like had to be addressed. And the debate was fierce. On one side were those who believed that the emperor system itself, the very concept of divine imperial authority, was the root cause of Japanese militarism and aggression. These voices argued that to leave Hirohito on the throne was to leave intact the ideological machinery that had produced the war. They pointed to the Meiji Constitution, which had theoretically placed enormous power in the emperor's hands. They pointed to the fact that Japanese soldiers had fought, died, committed atrocities, and refused to surrender precisely because they believed they were doing so in service of a living God. How could you build a democratic Japan, they asked, while keeping the living God in place? Among these voices were some of the most respected figures in American public life. The former Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, various members of the State Department who had spent years documenting Japanese war crimes, Australian and Chinese officials who had suffered the most directly at Japanese hands and who felt that anything short of Hirohito's prosecution was a betrayal of every person who had died under his flag. Australia's position was particularly strong. The Australian government, under pressure from its own population and its own returning veterans, explicitly demanded that Hirohito be included in war crimes proceedings. China, which had endured 15 years of Japanese aggression, beginning with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, was equally insistent. The Soviet Union, newly entered into the Pacific War in its final days, had its own reasons to want the emperor's power destroyed, though Soviet motivations were as much geopolitical as moral. On the other side were the pragmatists, and they were equally serious and equally well-credentialed. These were people like Joseph Grew, who had served as U.S. ambassador to Japan before the war, and who understood the Japanese imperial system in ways that most Americans did not. Grew argued fiercely that the emperor was not simply a figurehead, but was also not simply a warmonger, that he occupied a unique symbolic and psychological place in Japanese culture that had no equivalent in Western political systems, that to destroy the imperial institution carelessly would be to destroy the one stable structure around which post-war Japan could be rebuilt. Grew, and those who shared his view, pointed to something crucial. In August 1945, it had been Hirohito himself who had broken the deadlock in the Japanese Supreme War Council and authorized Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. The militarists in the government had been willing to fight to the last Japanese civilian, to turn the entire home islands into a battleground, to accept casualties in the millions rather than surrender. It had been Hirohito's personal intervention, his recorded speech broadcast to the nation on August 15th, that had ended the war. That speech, the Gyokuan Hoso, the Jewel Voice broadcast, had been the first time in history that a Japanese emperor had ever spoken directly to the general public, and its effect had been decisive. Without Hirohito's willingness to act in that moment, many analysts believed the war in the Pacific would have continued for many more months, possibly into 1946, resulting in casualty figures on all sides that were almost unimaginable. Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, was projected by American planners to result in anywhere from 250,000 to over 1 million American casualties alone. Japanese military and civilian deaths would have dwarfed even those figures. Hirohito had stopped that. Did that buy him anything? Should it have? These were the questions that hung in the air as the occupation began. MacArthur moved quickly to form his own view, and his view, once formed, was firm. He wanted Hirohito kept in place, kept functional, and kept useful. He wanted to use the emperor's authority and symbolic power to smooth the occupation and the reconstruction, and to do that, he needed to meet the man. The meeting happened on September 27, 1945. Just 25 days after the formal surrender ceremony. It took place at the American Embassy in Tokyo. Hirohito arrived and was accompanied by his Grand Chamberlain and his interpreter. MacArthur met him with minimal ceremony, which was itself a statement. In Japanese court protocol, the emperor was surrounded by rituals of deference so elaborate and detailed that even senior ministers were expected to move and speak in carefully prescribed ways in his presence. MacArthur offered him none of that. He greeted the emperor informally, as one leader might greet another, not as a conquered man meeting his conqueror, but not as a divine ruler meeting a subordinate either. What was said in that meeting has been described differently by different sources. MacArthur's own account, written later, described Hirohito as taking full personal responsibility for the war, and for everything that Japan had done during it. MacArthur wrote that he was moved by this, that he had expected to see a frightened man seeking to protect himself, and instead saw a monarch with the dignity to accept the full weight of his nation's actions. Other accounts, including analyses of Japanese records and later scholarship, are more skeptical. Some historians argue that what Hirohito actually said was more carefully worded, more diplomatically ambiguous, and that MacArthur, consciously or not, interpreted it in the way that best served his already formed conclusion. Whatever the precise content of the conversation, the political effect was clear. MacArthur came away from that meeting more convinced than ever that Hirohito should be protected. A photograph was taken at the meeting, and that photograph became one of the most famous images to come out of the entire Pacific War and its aftermath. It shows MacArthur, tall, relaxed, hands on his hips, in his open-collared military shirt without ribbons or decorations, towering physically next to Hirohito, who stands ramrod straight in formal diplomatic morning dress, white gloves held in his hands, visibly smaller, visibly formal, visibly in the presence of the man who now ran his country. The Japanese government initially tried to have the photograph suppressed because they felt it was demeaning to the emperor. MacArthur's headquarters ordered it published in every Japanese newspaper. It ran the next morning. For millions of Japanese, seeing their divine emperor standing next to an American general in that posture was a shattering moment. The divine was human, the untouchable had been touched, and yet the emperor was still there, still present, still functioning. That was the message MacArthur wanted to send to Japan, and it was the message that defined the entire occupation strategy that followed. Now, the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which began in May 1946 and ran until November 1948. This was the Pacific equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, and it prosecuted 28 Japanese military and government leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 7 of those men would ultimately be hanged, others received life sentences or shorter prison terms. And throughout all of it, through 2.5 years of testimony, evidence, and argument about what the Japanese leadership had known, decided, and authorized, one name was conspicuously, deliberately absent from the dock: Hirohito. The question of how and why the American authorities managed to keep Hirohito out of the Tokyo trials is one of the most revealing and in some ways most troubling aspects of the entire post-war occupation story. Because the evidence, if the goal had been genuine accountability, was there. Or at least, it was complicated enough and significant enough that it demanded examination rather than exclusion. The problem was structural as much as political. The American authorities who managed the prosecution of the Tokyo trials were working under explicit guidance from MacArthur's headquarters. And that guidance, while never stated with crude bluntness in official documents, was understood to mean that the evidence and testimony presented at trial should not implicate the emperor in a way that would force the question of his prosecution. This created some extraordinary contortions. Several of the defendants at Tokyo, including figures like former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, had to be carefully managed so that their testimony did not land the emperor in legal jeopardy. Tojo himself, in early questioning before the trial, had actually made statements suggesting that no major decision in Japan could have been made without the emperor's knowledge or approval. That was dangerous. The American prosecution team recognized it immediately. Prosecutors and investigators met with Tojo to, let us say, help him understand how to frame his answers differently. Tojo subsequently testified in ways that drew a clear line between the military leadership's decision-making and the emperor's personal role, portraying Hirohito as a constitutional monarch who had deferred to his military advisors and whose personal desire had always been for peace. This was, to put it carefully, a selective account of Japanese wartime decision-making. Historical scholarship in the decades since has made clear that Hirohito was not the passive figurehead that this narrative portrayed. He was engaged. He asked questions. He reviewed military plans. He was briefed on operations. He attended liaison conferences where strategy was discussed. The degree to which he personally authorized specific decisions, particularly the worst of the atrocities committed by Japanese forces, is genuinely debated by historians and probably cannot be fully resolved given the destruction or concealment of many Japanese government records during the final days of the war. But the idea that he was simply a constitutional monarch who rubber-stamped whatever his militarists decided and had no independent agency or knowledge is almost certainly not accurate. The most damning body of evidence in this regard comes from the research of historians like Herbert Bix, whose 2000 biography of Hirohito, which won the Pulitzer Prize, drew on previously unavailable Japanese-language sources to construct a picture of an emperor who was actively involved in military planning, who pressed his commanders for more aggressive action at various points in the war, and who bore a degree of moral responsibility that the post-war narrative had deliberately obscured. But in 1945 and 1946, That scholarship was decades away. The Americans in Tokyo had more immediate concerns. MacArthur's occupation was succeeding. Japan was being demilitarized, democratized, and reconstructed at a pace that surprised almost everyone. The Japanese people, guided in part by the emperor's own public statements endorsing cooperation with the occupation, were proving cooperative. The feared mass resistance had not materialized, and keeping Hirohito in place, keeping him protected from prosecution, keeping him as a functioning symbol of continuity and stability, was seen as directly responsible for that success. There was also a rapidly changing geopolitical context. By 1946 and into 1947, the Cold War was no longer a vague concern. It was the organizing principle of American foreign policy. China was in the midst of a civil war that would bring Mao Zedong and the Communist Party to power in 1949. The Soviet Union was spreading its influence across Eastern Europe. Korea would be next. In this environment, a stable, pro-American Japan was not just desirable, it was essential. It was a cornerstone of American strategy in the Pacific. And anything that destabilized Japan, including the trial and potential execution of its emperor, was a threat to that strategy. This is the context in which the American decision on Hirohito has to be understood. It was not purely cynical, but it was not purely principled either. It was a calculation. A geopolitical calculation dressed in the language of practical necessity. And the victims of Japanese aggression, particularly the Chinese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, the comfort women, the POWs who had survived the camps, had to live with the outcome of that calculation without ever being asked whether they found it acceptable. So what did happen to Hirohito, practically, day to day, in the years of the occupation? He continued to live in the imperial palace in Tokyo, which had been partially damaged by American bombing, but remained standing and functional. His life changed in significant ways. He no longer held divine status in any legal or constitutional sense. The new Japanese constitution, written essentially by MacArthur's staff and promulgated in 1947, redefined the emperor as the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power. That was an extraordinary sentence in the context of Japanese imperial history. It was the formal end of the Meiji-era conception of the emperor as a divine sovereign who stood above and outside the political system. Hirohito also made public appearances in ways that had never happened before. He began a series of tours around Japan, visiting factories, schools, hospitals, local communities. These were carefully managed events, but they represented something genuinely new. The emperor, walking among ordinary people, shaking hands, or at least bowing in close proximity to them, asking questions, expressing interest in their lives. For many Japanese, particularly older ones, who had been conditioned to believe that even glimpsing the emperor directly was an act of profound significance, this was disorienting. For younger Japanese, and for the reformers working to build a new democratic culture, it was precisely the point. Hirohito also returned to his personal passion, which was marine biology. This is one of the stranger and more humanizing details of his biography. Before the war, and throughout it and after it, Hirohito was a serious, dedicated amateur marine biologist. He had a laboratory at the Imperial Palace. He published scientific papers. He collected and cataloged sea creatures, particularly hydrozoans. His genuine enthusiasm for the natural sciences was documented by everyone who knew him in any personal capacity. And during the occupation years, he spent significant time working in his laboratory. A man who had been at the center of the most destructive conflict in human history, retreating to a world of tide pools and microscopes. Whether this was therapy, escape, genuine devotion to science, or simply the expression of who he actually was beneath the imperial role, no one can say definitively. MacArthur met with Hirohito multiple additional times during the occupation years, and the two men developed a relationship that was described by MacArthur in warm terms, though historians have noted that MacArthur's accounts of his own relationships tended to reflect favorably on MacArthur. What is clear is that the emperor cooperated fully and often visibly with the occupation's goals. He made statements endorsing the new constitution. He supported democratization. He visited MacArthur's headquarters. He did not, publicly or privately, in any way that leaked outward, express resentment or opposition to the direction the occupation was taking his country. Whether this cooperation was genuine conviction, resignation, or simple self-preservation is a question that biographers and historians continue to debate. The Japanese imperial system had always produced rulers who expressed themselves with enormous care and indirection, and Hirohito was a master of saying a great deal in very few words, while leaving his precise personal feelings almost entirely opaque. Meanwhile, outside Japan, the pressure to do something more serious about Hirohito's role in the war never fully disappeared. The Australian government continued to protest. Various advocacy groups, representing POWs and survivors of Japanese atrocities, made their voices heard. Some American journalists and commentators wrote critically about the apparent double standard. Nuremberg had put German leaders on trial, and some of those leaders had been executed. Why was Japan's emperor receiving what amounted to a formal exemption? The official American response to these criticisms was always essentially MacArthur's answer: stability, necessity. The occupation was working, Japan was changing, the alternative would have been chaos. And to be fair, there was genuine truth in that argument. The occupation of Japan was, by almost any historical standard, remarkably successful. Within a generation, Japan had become a stable democracy, an economic powerhouse, and a close American ally. Those outcomes were not accidental. They resulted from decisions made during the occupation, including decisions about how to handle the emperor. But success in geopolitical terms is not the same thing as justice in moral terms, and the tension between those two things runs through the entire story of what happened to Hirohito after the war, like a fault line that the official narrative never quite managed to paper over. The occupation formally ended on April 28, 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty came into force and Japan regained its sovereignty. MacArthur himself had been relieved of command in 1951 by President Truman, dismissed abruptly over his public disagreements with administration policy during the Korean War. It was a dramatic end to MacArthur's long and complicated reign in Tokyo. He left Japan and never returned. Hirohito, however, stayed. He reigned as Emperor of Japan for decades after the occupation ended. He witnessed Japan's astonishing economic recovery. He saw his country become the world's second-largest economy. He watched the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, a moment the Japanese government had chosen deliberately as a symbol of the nation's post-war rehabilitation and return to the international community. He saw the student movements of the 1960s, the political turbulence of the 1970s, the technological revolution of the 1980s. He gave very few interviews that probed anything sensitive. When journalists or visiting dignitaries occasionally asked him about the war, about his role, about what he felt or remembered or regretted, his answers were always careful, qualified, indirect. One of the most discussed of these exchanges came during a 1975 press conference when a reporter asked him directly about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. His response was so carefully worded, so hedged with diplomatic indirection, that it was interpreted wildly differently by different observers. Some saw regret, some saw evasion. Some saw a man who had spent 30 years learning to say nothing while appearing to say something. Questions about whether he ever privately expressed guilt or remorse about the war and what Japan had done during it are almost impossible to answer with certainty. His longtime chamberlain and the court officials around him were extraordinarily protective of any private expressions or conversations. Some accounts, including Hirohito's own monologue, a lengthy reflection he apparently dictated to court officials in the late 1940s, were used by MacArthur's staff partly as source material in constructing the post-war narrative about the emperor's wartime role. That document itself became a subject of historical controversy, with scholars debating what it revealed and what it concealed. In his later years, Hirohito's health began to decline. He had been a relatively vigorous man in his middle decades. But age took its toll, as it does. He underwent surgery in 1987 for what was described officially in vague terms, but was widely understood to be related to intestinal cancer. The Japanese government and the Imperial Household Agency maintained the traditional practice of extreme reticence about the emperor's health, but it was clear to observers that he was seriously ill. The period of his final illness became a remarkable chapter in Japanese cultural and social history. As it became known that the emperor was unwell and might be dying, Japan entered a period of self-imposed national solemnity. Entertainment events were scaled back or canceled. Public celebrations were muted. Millions of Japanese citizens lined up to sign well-wishing registers at the palace. The weight of what Hirohito represented, not just as an individual, but as the living link to a version of Japan that no longer existed and yet remained embedded in the national consciousness, became palpable in those months. Emperor Hirohito died on January 7, 1989. He was 87 years old. His reign had lasted 62 years, making it one of the longest imperial reigns in Japanese history. The era name for his reign had been Showa, meaning radiant peace or enlightened harmony, an era name selected at the beginning of his reign that history had made painfully ironic, given what the Showa era had actually contained. His death prompted a massive outpouring of public mourning in Japan, as well as a renewal of international discussion about his legacy and about the decisions that had been made in 1945 and 1946 that had allowed him to die not in a prison or on a gallows, but in the imperial palace of a prosperous and democratic Japan. His son, Akihito, succeeded him, becoming the emperor of the Heisei era. Akihito himself would prove to be a notably forthcoming figure on questions of historical responsibility, making explicit apologies and expressions of remorse for Japan's wartime conduct during his reign that Hirohito had never made in anything like explicit terms. In 2019, Akihito abdicated, the first Japanese emperor to do so in 2 centuries, and was succeeded by his son, Naruhito, who reigns today. Now, let us come back to the central question that hangs over all of this. The Americans made a decision. They decided to protect Hirohito, to exempt him from prosecution, to preserve the imperial institution as a tool of occupation policy. Was that the right decision? The argument in its favor is not trivial. Japan did stabilize. The occupation did succeed in transforming a militaristic empire into a functioning democracy. Japanese society did not revolt. The predicted chaos did not materialize. The Cold War context did require a stable Pacific ally, and Japan has been that ally for 70 years and counting. If the goal was a peaceful, democratic, prosperous Japan that would not again threaten its neighbors or the world, then the results justify at least a serious engagement with the pragmatic argument. But the counter-argument is also not trivial. Justice delayed and justice denied are not the same thing, but they rhyme uncomfortably. The survivors of Japanese wartime atrocities, particularly in Korea and China, carried for the rest of their lives the weight of knowing that the man at the top of the system that had victimized them faced no legal consequence. The comfort women, the forced laborers, the prisoners of war, the civilians of Nanking and Manila and Singapore, their suffering was real, documented, massive in scale, and its ultimate accounting was shaped as much by American geopolitical calculations as by any genuine pursuit of justice. The Korean government and the Chinese government have pointed to the post-war settlement around Hirohito and the imperial system for decades as evidence that Japan's historical reckoning with the war was fundamentally incomplete. The contrast with Germany is frequently drawn. Germany was forced by the occupation and by the weight of the Holocaust documentation and the Nuremberg trials to engage in a thorough and sustained national reckoning with what it had done. Japan's reckoning was softer, more ambiguous, more politically managed. Whether that difference is entirely or even primarily due to the decision to protect Hirohito is debatable. But it is not disconnected from it either. There is also the simpler moral question. When you exempt the most powerful individual in a system from accountability for what that system did, you send a message about what accountability actually means. It means something for everyone else. It means something different for the man at the top. That message did not go unheard in Asia in 1945, and it has not been forgotten in the decades since. Historians continue to argue about Hirohito's actual degree of personal responsibility for specific decisions and specific crimes. Bix's account of an actively engaged emperor was contested by scholars who felt he went too far, that the Japanese system's diffusion of responsibility across multiple overlapping bureaucratic and military structures made it genuinely difficult to assign personal moral culpability in the way that Western legal traditions would require. That is a serious argument that deserves serious engagement, but it is also true that the post-war American approach did not seriously try to make that determination. It assumed the answer it needed and then constructed the evidence accordingly. What is perhaps most striking about the entire story, when you step back and look at it whole, is how thoroughly it reveals the gap between the rhetoric of post-war justice and the reality of post-war power. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials were presented to the world as the dawn of a new era in international law, an era in which leaders would be held accountable for wars of aggression and crimes against humanity regardless of their rank or their nation's geopolitical importance to the victors. That was the stated principle. The actual practice was messier, more interested, more strategic. The victors decided what justice looked like. and they decided it in ways that served their own interests. That is not a uniquely American criticism. The Soviet Union's participation in Nuremberg while suppressing knowledge of the Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces had murdered thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals, was its own exercise in selective accountability. The British and French handled their own complicated colonial-era behaviors with their own forms of historical management. No power that emerged from World War II was entirely clean. But the specific decision about Hirohito, made by specific men in specific offices in Tokyo and Washington in the months after the surrender, had specific consequences that played out over specific decades, and those consequences were not evenly distributed. They fell most heavily on the people who had already suffered the most. MacArthur is long dead. The men who sat in the Daiichi building and made the calculations are gone. Hirohito himself has been gone for over 3 decades. But the questions they generated, the decisions they made or avoided, are still alive. They are alive in the ongoing political tensions between Japan and its neighbors. They are alive in the debates within Japan itself about how to teach its wartime history. They are alive every time a surviving comfort woman gives testimony, or every time a Korean or Chinese diplomat raises the issue of historical responsibility in a meeting with Japanese counterparts. History does not care about clean conclusions. It rarely provides them. What it provides instead is this: the record, the evidence, the sequence of decisions and their consequences, the gap between what was said and what was done, and the lingering, persistent, deeply human need of the people who suffered to have what happened to them acknowledged fully, honestly, and without the filter of someone else's strategic interests. The Americans decided to spare Hirohito. They decided it was necessary. They decided it served the greater good as they defined it. They may even have been right in the narrowest strategic sense, but the men and women who had lived through the Greater East Asia War and who had hoped that the end of that war would bring something that felt like genuine justice deserved more than to be told that necessity had other plans. That is the story of what happened to Japan's Emperor Hirohito after the surrender. It is not a simple story. It was never going to be. The most consequential decisions in history rarely are. They are made by imperfect people, under impossible pressure, with incomplete information and enormous stakes. And then the rest of us spend the generations that follow trying to understand them, trying to assess them, trying to learn from them, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not. What is clear is that the decision was made. It shaped a nation and a region and an era, and its echoes have not finished traveling. If you found this worth your time, and if these are the kinds of deep, fully explored stories that you want more of, then subscribe right now. There are dozens of stories like this one waiting, the ones that get a footnote in the official history, but deserve the full treatment. The decisions made in private that changed the public world. The gaps between what was claimed and what was done. This is the kind of history that actually matters, because it is not just about what happened, it is about understanding why, and about what that why tells us about the world we are still living in. The war ended in August 1945. The questions it raised are still open. And the story of Emperor Hirohito, the man who spoke to his people for the first time to tell them that the war was lost, and who then lived for 44 more years in the palace that the occupation chose not to take from him, is one of the most layered and most revealing of all of them. He died in January 1989, at the end of a century he had watched transform beyond recognition. He was mourned by millions. He was judged by millions more, and the full accounting of his reign, of what he knew, what he decided, what he allowed, and what he might have stopped, remains one of the great unresolved questions of modern history. Not because the evidence has all disappeared, but because the decision made in Tokyo in 1945 by the Americans who ran the occupation ensured that the question would never be put to the one formal test that might have begun to settle it. That decision was made. Its consequences were real, and the history of the 20th century cannot be fully understood without understanding both.